Hate speech has become a widespread phenomenon in the daily life of young people around the world. Our next keynote speaker is the principal investigator of an international research project on hate speech among adolescents in 3 world regions, and of a national research project which investigates how students and teachers deal with offline hate speech in schools. I'm so proud to introduce Dr. Sebastian Wachs, Deputy Professor for Education and Socialization Theory at the University of Potsdam in Germany. And since Sebastian is actually here in person, I think we should also stamp our feet and clap our hands to welcome him up on stage. Welcome, Sebastian Wachs.
So, hello everyone. I hope you had a great time so far. Before I start with my presentation, I'd like to thank the organizers of the World Anti-Bullying Forum for inviting me here today. As you can see on my first slide, I want to talk with you today about bullying and hate speech. The issue of bullying has gained a lot of attention in the last couple of years. However, most of the attention has been focused on hate speech among adults. So only slowly the interest in hate speech research among young people is developing. Addressing this gap in the literature, I'd like to present you today what we found out so far about the relationship between hate speech and bullying among young people. The main question of my presentation will be, are bullying and hate speech 2 sides of the same coin? I've divided my talk into 4 main parts. I'll begin with the definition of hate speech, and this is already a quite difficult thing. After that, I will highlight and outline conceptual similarities and differences between both constructs. In the third part, I will present some of our empirical findings concerning the relationship between hate speech and bullying. This part will be based on 3 studies. 1 national study, cross-sectional, which we conducted in Germany and Switzerland. Another study, which we conducted in 8 countries across 3 world regions. And finally, 1 longitudinal study, which has been conducted by my dear colleague Manuel Games-Guaudix in Spain. Based on these 3 studies, I would like to look into prevalence rates, correlations between hate speech and bullying, pathways between both phenomena, and finally, I want to look into moderation effects, which might help to understand why both constructs might be related. My presentation will end with an outlook on future research and a take-home message. So let's start with the definition of hate speech. And it's fair to say that the term hate speech was originally coined by the law professor and activist Marie Matsuda in the late 1980s in the USA. Matsuda's central intention was to raise awareness and call for legal actions against this type of violence. Since then, the term developed a panoply of differing definitions and uses within a wide range of different disciplines. When we talk about hate speech, there are 2 common myths. The first myth is the myth of hate in hate speech and was originally described by the philosopher Alexander Brown. Hate speech is not always connected with emotions, feelings, or attitudes of hate or hatred. But in fact, it is often, or it can be explained by motivations or motives like fear, fun, the need to fit in, or other potential motives. In fact, our own qualitative research has shown that the 2 basic human needs, the need for power and the need for affiliation, are crucial in explaining why adolescents engage in hate speech as perpetrators. The second myth is the myth of speech in hate speech. Hate speech cannot only be expressed verbally, but also by in many different ways. It can be explained in certain actions, through graffitis at schools or in the public sphere. It can also be expressed in posts, texts, messages, images, etc. So we need to keep this in mind when we talk about hate speech, that it's not always related to hate or speech. When we started to investigate hate speech, we were quite surprised that there is no common definition in the field of psychology or educational science, which all scholars can agree on. So my colleague Julia Conceptually conducted a systematic review on research on hate speech among school-age children. As part of this systematic review, she also looked in how the different scholars have defined hate speech. And if you haven't seen the poster yet, you should go out there, maybe not after the talk, but there are many different interesting results which Julia is presenting here at the conference. Based on this systematic review, we discussed different options and created the following definition, which is hate speech is derogatory expression about people on the basis of assigned group characteristics, for example, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, etc. Hate speech is based on an intention to cause harm and can cause harm on different levels. For example, on the individual level, communal level, or even societal level. At the next point, I would like to talk to you about the conceptual differences and similarities between hate speech and bullying. So I tried to make a figure to make this a little bit clearer, but after the 2 slides, you will see that it's in general quite unclear where the both constructs overlap and where they don't. Conceptually, hate speech and bullying exhibit both commonalities and differences. Both phenomena are usually carried out with the intention to hurt a person or a group of persons. In bullying, however, the aggressors have either the perception or are in reality more powerful than the targets. In addition, bullying is often described as a repeated behavior which is carried out in relatively stable groups, and bullying is also often fed by interpersonal conflicts and complex group dynamics within those groups. In contrast, hate speech may be carried out as a single act among people who are not members of one certain group or don't even know each other. Hate speech is also often triggered by social or political events. Whereas bullying is often directed against people based on perceived individual characteristics, hate speech is not. Hate speech is necessarily based on prejudicial attitudes and group-focused enmity. And hate speech is something that is directed against the social identity of a person. But unfortunately, it's not that easy, because we have seen it also at this conference that sometimes bullying is also based on a prejudicial nature. And bullying can also include the devaluation of social groups. There's a lot of research currently about racist bullying, homophobic bullying, transphobic bullying, yeah? And in hate speech, it's the same. Sometimes there is an imbalance of power between the person who is carrying out hate speech and the person or the group of person who is the target of hate speech. Hate speech can also be conducted repeatedly, And in some cases, there's also a social relationship between the target and the victim of hate speech. Empirical research might help us to understand where these both constructs overlap and where maybe they don't. From a conceptual point of view, one idea would be to say, okay, there where bullying and hate speech overlap, if they agree on or if they share the prejudicial nature or attitudes, then we can say it's bias-based bullying, or maybe bullying-based hate speech. But again, we are really at the very beginning of investigating this issue, and much more research is needed to really understand the differences and similarities. We have some empirical research conducted on this question, and I'm happy to present this now. On this slide, you can see the prevalence rates for bullying and hate speech in schools. We can see that slightly more students reported that they were hate speech perpetrators or victims than bullying perpetrators or victims. In the next step, let's have a look on the correlations between each variable. You can see here that hate speech and bullying perpetration is moderately correlated. In addition, hate speech and bullying victimization is even strongly correlated. So we can see here empirical evidence for a correlation between hate speech and bullying in schools. Let's have a look now, how is the situation in the cyberspace? Because often when we talk about hate speech, we think, yeah, there are hate comments on Facebook or something like that, but hate speech can also be conducted in schools, like we have just seen it. In the cyberspace, you can see here also the prevalence rates at first. We can see that slightly more students reported that they were perpetrators or victims of online hate speech compared with online bullying, perpetration, or victimization. Now, if we look on the correlations, we find a similar pattern like before. We can see that online hate speech perpetration and bullying perpetration are positively correlated. And the same is true for online hate speech victimization and online bullying victimization. These latter findings are in line with our cross-national study, which we conducted in 8 countries. You can see here the correlations in the different countries, and one finding is that in most countries we found positive correlations between online hate speech and online bullying for both the perpetrators and the victim side. And only in South Korea we did not find any significant correlation. We also did not find a significant correlation in India, but only for the victim's perspective. So we know now that both are correlated, but we don't know whether hate speech predicts bullying or bullying predicts hate speech. Or maybe both predict each other. So to answer this question, we need longitudinal research. And I'm happy to share first findings of our longitudinal study with you today. You can see here the results for online hate speech. And we can see that online hate speech perpetration predicts online bullying perpetration 6 months later. However, online bullying perpetration did not predict online hate speech perpetration. So let's have a look for the victims. And we see here also the same pattern. It's like online hate speech victimization predicted online bullying victimization 6 months later, but online bullying victimization did not predict online hate speech victimization 6 months later. To understand when, for whom, and under what circumstances the relationship between hate speech and bullying will hold, we need to consider further variables. In research, we call these variables moderating variables. And I have just run analysis with 2 moderating variables. In the perpetrator model, I included moral disengagement. And the findings show that the relationship between hate speech perpetration and bullying perpetration becomes stronger when moral disengagement increases. And this was true for the offline and online context. Here you can see the results for the victimization model, and you can see that assertiveness moderated the relationship between hate speech victimization and bullying victimization. The effect was different in nature. So the findings show that assertiveness decreases the magnitude of the relationship between hate speech victimization and bullying victimization. So I want to give a brief outlook on future research in the field of investigating the hate speech bullying relationship, and some questions that might be interesting for future research are, for example, do the same risk factors explain the frequency rates from bullying and hate speech, or are there distinct risk factors that help us to explain why bullying or hate speech occur in school or cyberspace? Another question that might be important to answer is, are the consequences for the victims of bullying and hate speech the same or different? Or are the consequences for victims who suffer in both, are they maybe even worse? And finally, an interesting question might be to look into spillover effects. So if we implement anti-bullying prevention programs at schools, does this affect in any way the frequency rates of hate speech at these very schools? Overall, the take-home message of my presentation is hate speech and bullying seem to be different phenomena, but they are closely related. Hence, we can conclude that both phenomena seem to be 2 sides of the same coin. Hate speech incidents might be the root of some bullying cases. Maybe it is like, especially if we are dealing with bias-based bullying, that hate speech incidents or techniques are used by students who are perpetrating bias-based bullying. And finally, it is very important that we understand what strategies are effective in preventing students from engaging in hate speech. I'm very happy that at my university, in my working group, we just developed the prevention program Hateless, and we will launch this program next year, and you saw already some figures and pictures of the program. So I'm happy to learn more about how we can support schools in preventing hate speech among students. Here are some references. Then thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any question you have.
Thank you, Sebastian
Thank you.
Wachs. This was a fantastic presentation also, and thank you for interlinking hate speech and bullying the way you're doing like this, like two sides of the same coin, and also very. I think I learned a little bit of the methods and how you're doing it so stepwise. So thank you for guiding us by the hand a little bit through your presentation. We have got questions also from the audience, so I just want to address them. Do you have comment on how hate speech increases levels of minority stress?
Sorry?
Do you have a comment on how hate speech might increase levels of minority stress?
For now, we don't know much about the consequences of hate speech. So to be here as precise as possible, we would need to conduct longitudinal studies to investigate consequences. But I think this theory or hypothesis might be a good framework for future research.
Thank you. And someone wrote, considering the differences between hate speech and bullying, do you think they should be treated differently within a school context or at the same time?
This is a question we might answer with future research as well, because maybe we can implement in some bullying prevention programs aspects about diversity, etc., and maybe this will also reduce the hate speech prevalence rate. But we need to look into this much more. So for now, I think we need specialized programs, because there are so many topics important in relation to hate speech. So we need to teach or educate adolescents about democratic values, how to express your opinion without hurting the other side. Because right now, we hear very often that people think they are not allowed to express their opinion. But that's not the thing. Especially in Europe, everyone can say what she wants, but we have to stick to some social rules. And also students need to learn that.
I start thinking about, I got more, great. Is hate speech rising in Germany?
It is a big issue in Germany, for sure, but to be honest, I think it is all over the world. Because as you can see in our cross-national study, the idea of conducting the study started in a workshop in Thailand, and the prevalence rates are everywhere relatively high. So it's a big issue, and I think many societies around the world are facing exactly this.
Thank you. I'm just recalling a book by, I think it's Shelley, maybe, but it's called The Web of Violence. And in the end of the chapters, they have different interventions, ideas, and different types of violence. So they have like anti-bullying ideas. So how could you address certain risk factors, sexual harassment interventions? And it just reminds me of that there could be some core factors that are risk factors that are common, and there could be some that are not common. So you have to do a little bit of some core aspects together and some specific things. Do you have a comment on that idea?
Yeah, sure. In the presentation, there was already the hint that, for example, moral disengagement plays a major role in explaining bullying perpetration, but also hate speech perpetration, and this makes totally sense. And I think there are many intrapersonal factors, but also interpersonal factors like the norms within the school class. So we just published a paper that looked into different kind of norms in explaining why adolescents engaging in hate speech. And this is also quite familiar with the bullying research.
And what can teachers do to prevent or decrease hate speech?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we also surveyed teachers in our HAS project, but we haven't analyzed the data yet. So of course, a quick intervention is the most important thing. I think it's important that teachers don't allow derogatory expressions or language in the classroom. And they need to point out and they need to discuss with the students why it is not part of our common value to judge a person because he or she is related to a certain social group. So that, yeah.
Thank you. And the last question starts with, thank you, Sebastian, for your presentation. I have a quick question. Do you think that differentiating between different kinds of hate speech on the basis of the target, i.e. sex, gender, identity, race, sexual orientation, could be useful to understand specific correlates of each of them? Or do you expect similar correlates, risk factors, protective factors for different kinds of hate speech?
This is quite interesting. We also measured because of, or we measured against which social group the hate speech was directed, and also why students experienced hate speech. But we need to look in that a little bit more. It might be interesting to look if there are certain clusters, for example, that some students are devaluating a cluster of different social groups, if there are correlations between such groups. So that's an interesting idea.
Thank you for all your questions. Thank you for very qualified questions. Thank you for extremely qualified answers and a wonderful presentation. Sebastian Wachs, thank you.
Thank you
very, very much.
Thank you.